The cold morning air of December 9th, 1944, carried the acrid smell of burnt diesel and cordwood smoke across the Belgian countryside near Elsenborn Ridge. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed his back against the frozen earth of a hastily dug foxhole, his fingers numb around the bolt of his Carabiner 98 Kurz. In the distance, through the skeletal remains of a shattered pine forest, he could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire. But something about it was wrong. The rhythm was too fast, too sustained, too mechanical. American riflemen, he had been told repeatedly during training at Grafenwöhr, were poorly trained conscripts armed with bolt-action rifles inferior to German engineering. Yet the volume of fire now ripping through the winter air suggested something his instructors had never prepared him for. Within 72 hours, Klaus would be a prisoner of war. And within 72 hours after that, sitting in a processing camp near Liège, he would hold in his hands a weapon that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of the war he had been fighting. The M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle, a firearm issued not to elite troops, not to specialists, but to every single American infantryman, would reveal to him a truth more devastating than any artillery barrage. Germany had sent its soldiers into battle against an enemy whose standard equipment was a generation ahead of their own. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how German prisoners of war discovered that the American military had equipped every squad with automatic firepower that the Wehrmacht reserved only for dedicated machine gunners. It is a story about the collision between propaganda and material reality, between nationalist confidence and industrial capacity, and about the moment when captured soldiers realized that Germany's vaunted engineering superiority was a carefully constructed illusion. To understand the shock that German POWs experienced when they encountered the M1 Garand, we must first understand the doctrinal philosophy that shaped Wehrmacht infantry tactics throughout World War II. The German army entered the war with a fundamental belief system about infantry combat that had been refined through decades of military thought. Infantry squads were built around the machine gun, and riflemen existed primarily to support and protect that machine gun. The standard German infantry squad in 1944 consisted of 10 men organized into a distinctive structure. At the center of this structure was the MG-42 machine gun team, 2 men who carried and operated what was arguably the finest belt-fed machine gun of the war. This weapon could fire up to 1,200 rounds per minute, creating a sound so distinctive that American soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. The remaining 8 men in the squad carried bolt-action Carabiner 98 Kurz rifles, weapons that were mechanically excellent but required the shooter to manually work the bolt between each shot. This organizational structure was not an accident or a resource limitation. It reflected a deliberate tactical philosophy called Auftragstactik, mission-type tactics, that emphasized decentralized decision-making and combined arms coordination. The machine gun provided the overwhelming firepower necessary to suppress enemy positions or defend against assaults. The riflemen maneuvered to protect the machine gun, carry additional ammunition, and engage targets that the machine gunner could not effectively address. The squad leader, typically armed with an MP-40 submachine gun, coordinated this dance of fire and movement. German military theorists believed this system represented the optimal use of industrial resources and tactical efficiency. Machine guns were expensive, complex, and required specialized training. Equipping every soldier with automatic or semi-automatic weapons would, according to this thinking, waste resources on capabilities that ordinary infantrymen did not need. The controlled, aimed fire of a bolt-action rifle, fired by a well-trained marksman, was considered more effective than the spray of semi-automatic fire from a less disciplined soldier. This philosophy had been reinforced by Germany's experience in World War I, where the doctrine of infiltration tactics, Stoßtrupp tactics, had proven successful. Small teams of specialized troops armed with automatic weapons and grenades would penetrate enemy lines, while follow-on forces with traditional rifles would exploit these breakthroughs. The lesson German military planners drew from this was not that every soldier needed automatic weapons, but that automatic weapons needed to be concentrated in the hands of specialists who could use them most effectively. By 1944, this doctrine had been taught to hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Men like Klaus Hartmann learned in training that the MG-42 was the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon, of the infantry squad. They were taught that German engineering and tactical sophistication would overcome any material disadvantages. They were told that American troops were poorly motivated, inadequately trained, and equipped with inferior weapons. The bolt-action Springfield rifle, they learned, was the standard American infantry weapon, a design that dated back to 1903 and was fundamentally similar to their own Karabiner 98 Kurz. What Klaus and millions of other German soldiers did not know, could not have known from their foxholes in Belgium or their garrison posts in France, was that the United States had fundamentally reimagined infantry firepower through industrial mass production. While German planners debated the theoretical merits of semi-automatic rifles and conducted limited trials with weapons like the Gewehr 41 and Gewehr 43, American factories were already producing semi-automatic rifles at a scale that would have seemed fantastical to Wehrmacht logistics officers. The M1 Garand had entered service with the United States Army in 1936, making it the first semi-automatic rifle to be adopted as a standard infantry weapon by any nation. The rifle's designer, John Cantius Garand, was a Canadian-born engineer working at Springfield Armory who had spent years developing a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle that could withstand the rigors of military service while maintaining the accuracy and reliability required for general issue. The Garand operated on a simple but ingenious principle. When a round was fired, a small portion of the propellant gas was diverted through a port near the muzzle into a cylinder beneath the barrel. This gas drove a piston rearward, which in turn drove the bolt carrier group backward, extracting and ejecting the spent cartridge case. A spring then drove the bolt forward, stripping a new round from the 8-round en-bloc clip and chambering it for firing. The entire cycle took a fraction of a second, allowing a trained rifleman to fire aimed shots as quickly as he could pull the trigger. This was not merely an incremental improvement over bolt-action rifles. It represented a fundamental multiplication of firepower. A soldier armed with a Karabiner 98 Kurz could, under ideal conditions, fire approximately 15 aimed shots per minute. A soldier armed with an M1 Garand could fire 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute, or even faster in rapid-fire situations. This meant that an 8-man American rifle squad, all armed with Garands, could produce as much rifle fire as a German squad of comparable size could produce only by adding submachine guns and positioning their machine gun for sustained fire. The scale of American production made this technological advantage even more devastating. Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms Company together produced approximately 4 million M1 Garand rifles between 1936 and 1945. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June of 1944, virtually every American infantryman in the European theater of operations carried a Garand. There were no exceptions for rear echelon troops, no substitutions with older bolt-action rifles for training units, no shortages that forced commanders to make do with inferior weapons. The United States had achieved something unprecedented in military history: complete standardization of a semi-automatic rifle as the basic infantry weapon across an army of millions. German intelligence officers were aware that the Americans possessed semi-automatic rifles. Reports from the Eastern Front mentioned similar Soviet weapons like the SVT-40, but the intelligence reports consistently underestimated the scale of American deployment and the implications for tactical combat. German training manuals continued to describe American infantry tactics as if they were fundamentally similar to German tactics, organized around machine gun positions with bolt-action rifles providing supporting fire. This intelligence failure was compounded by several factors. First, the Wehrmacht's own experience with semi-automatic rifles had been limited and largely unsuccessful. The Gewehr 41, introduced in 1941, was heavy, expensive, and mechanically unreliable. It was never produced in quantity sufficient to replace the Carabiner 98 Kurds, and most soldiers who used it complained about its performance. The improved Gewehr 43, introduced in 1943, was more successful, but still suffered from production limitations. Only about 400,000 Gewehr 43 rifles were ever manufactured, less than 10% of the number of M1 Garands produced by the United States. Second, German propaganda had consistently emphasized American military weakness. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and training lectures portrayed the United States as a nation of soft, undisciplined civilians who lacked the martial spirit necessary for sustained combat. American industrial production was acknowledged, but always with the implication that mass production came at the expense of quality. German soldiers were taught to trust in their superior training, their combat experience, and their advanced weaponry. The idea that American gangster soldiers might possess better individual weapons than the German army was fundamentally incompatible with this narrative. Third, the compartmentalized nature of combat meant that most German soldiers encountered American forces only in limited, chaotic engagements where the specific characteristics of enemy weapons were difficult to discern. The crack of rifle fire sounds similar whether it comes from a bolt-action or semi-automatic weapon. The visual appearance of the M1 Garand, glimpsed at a distance or in the confusion of combat, did not immediately reveal its mechanical advantages. Many German soldiers who faced American rifle fire attributed its volume to larger numbers of American troops, not to superior weapons in the hands of each individual soldier. The training Klaus Hartmann received at Grafenwohr in the summer of 1944 reflected all of these assumptions and misconceptions. The instructors, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front or the Italian campaign, spoke with the confidence of men who had survived years of combat. They taught their students how to establish proper fields of fire for the MG42, how to coordinate rifle fire with machine gun bursts, how to conserve ammunition during defensive operations. They emphasized that German tactical doctrine, German training, and German discipline would overcome any material advantages the enemy might possess. When instructors discussed American weapons, they focused on the Thompson submachine gun, which they correctly identified as expensive and limited in range, and the Browning automatic rifle, the Bar, which they described as a squad automatic weapon, similar in role to the German MG42, but inferior in rate of fire and reliability. The standard American rifle, they said, was either the bolt-action Springfield 1903 or the M1 Garand, and they implied that the Garand was issued only in limited numbers to specialized troops. This was not deliberate deception on the part of the instructors. It was systemic ignorance, shaped by incomplete intelligence reports, filtered through the lens of institutional pride and ideological conditioning. The German military establishment genuinely believed that its approach to infantry organization represented the peak of military efficiency, and that any deviations from this approach, such as equipping every rifleman with a semi-automatic weapon, represented wasteful American excess rather than tactical advantage. Klaus absorbed these lessons with the faith of a young soldier who had known nothing but the Nazi education system and Hitler youth indoctrination. He was 19 years old in December of 1944, too young to remember the Weimar Republic, too inexperienced to question the narratives he had been taught. When he was deployed to the Western Front as part of the desperate German counteroffensive known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, he carried with him not just his Carabiner 98 Kurds and 40 rounds of ammunition, but also an unshakable belief that German soldiers fought with the best equipment and training in the world. The offensive began on December 16, 1944, with a massive artillery barrage across an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise, overwhelming thinly spread American defensive positions and driving deep into Allied lines. Klaus's unit, part of the 6th Panzer Army's infantry formations, advanced through Luxembourg and into Belgium, encountering American resistance that seemed to confirm everything they had been taught. The Americans retreated. Their defensive positions crumbled. German tanks pushed forward, and for a few intoxicating days it seemed possible that the Wehrmacht might actually split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. But even in those early days of the offensive, Klaus noticed something that troubled him. When his squad assaulted American positions, the volume of incoming rifle fire seemed impossibly intense. His squad leader attributed it to American numerical superiority or to the presence of multiple machine gun positions. But Klaus, pressed into the frozen mud while bullets cracked overhead, could hear the rhythm of that fire. It was not the cyclic burr of a machine gun, nor was it the irregular crack of bolt-action rifles. It was something in between, sustained, rapid, but still individual shots rather than automatic. Fire. By December 21st, the German offensive had stalled. American reinforcements were arriving. The weather had cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to attack German supply columns. Klaus's unit found itself engaged in desperate fighting around Elsenborn Ridge, a crucial terrain feature that the Americans had reinforced with elements of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions. The battle for Elsenborn Ridge would become one of the decisive engagements of the Battle of the Bulge. German forces needed to capture the ridge to open up road networks necessary for their continued advance. American forces, recognizing the strategic importance of the position, committed significant resources to its defense. The fighting was brutal, conducted in sub-zero temperatures with both sides suffering from frostbite, ammunition shortages, and mounting casualties. Klaus's company was ordered to assault an American defensive position on the northern slope of the ridge. The attack began before dawn on December 22nd, with German infantry advancing through a snow-covered forest toward prepared American foxholes. The Americans had excellent fields of fire across the open ground approaching their positions. As Klaus's company emerged from the tree line, American rifles opened fire. The volume of fire was devastating. Klaus hit the ground immediately, scrambling for any depression or obstacle that might provide cover. All around him, men were falling. The squad's MG-42 team tried to set up their weapon to provide suppressing fire, but before they could bring the gun into action, both the gunner and his assistant were hit. Klaus, along with 3 other survivors from his squad, crawled backward into the forest, dragging wounded comrades when they could, abandoning them when they could not. What struck Klaus, what he would remember years later when recounting the experience, was not just the intensity of the fire, but its precision. These were not wild shots fired by panicked defenders. These were aimed shots, coming rapidly enough to keep the entire German attack force pinned down, preventing them from maneuvering, forcing them to choose between retreat and annihilation. His training had taught him that this level of sustained, accurate fire could only come from multiple machine gun positions supported by riflemen. but the American position he had been attacking was a single reinforced platoon, defending a frontage of perhaps 200 meters. The number of machine guns required to produce such fire should have been impossible for a unit that size. The attack failed. Klaus's company, which had numbered 120 men that morning, assembled 43 effectives that evening. The company commander was dead. 2 of the 3 platoon leaders were wounded. The unit was pulled out of the line and sent to the rear for reorganization. It was during this withdrawal on December 23rd that Klaus was captured. His group, now just 8 men, including 2 wounded, became separated from the rest of the company while moving through a forested area. They encountered an American patrol from the 1st Infantry Division, and after a brief exchange of fire, surrendered. Klaus was exhausted, hungry, and suffering from the early stages of frostbite. He had been in combat for 7 days. He had fired 64 rounds from his rifle and thrown 3 stick grenades. He had seen more men die in 1 week than he had imagined possible, and he was about to receive an education that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The American soldiers who processed Klaus and his fellow prisoners were professional but not cruel. They confiscated weapons, searched for documents, and administered basic first aid to the wounded. Klaus was given a cup of hot coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute he had been drinking for months, and a piece of white bread with butter. The abundance of such simple luxuries shocked him. These were front-line combat troops, yet they had access to fresh bread and real butter. His own unit's rations for the past week had consisted of hardtack, tinned meat of questionable origin, and whatever they could scavenge from abandoned Belgian farms. The prisoners were marched to a collection point and then transported by truck to a larger POW processing camp near Liège. It was Christmas Eve, 1944. As the truck bounced along rutted roads, Klaus stared at the evidence of American logistics capacity that lined the route. Endless columns of trucks carried supplies forward. Fuel dumps contained thousands of jerrycans. Artillery pieces sat parked in neat rows awaiting deployment. The scale of material was incomprehensible to a soldier whose own army had been struggling with fuel shortages and ammunition rationing for months. At the processing camp, Klaus and approximately 200 other recently captured German prisoners were assembled in a large warehouse. American guards, military police from the looks of their uniforms, supervised the processing with bureaucratic efficiency. Each prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, and interviewed about his unit, rank, and circumstances of capture. Personal items were inventoried and stored. Medical personnel examined the wounded and separated them for transfer to medical facilities. It was here, in this warehouse on Christmas Eve of 1944, that Klaus Hartmann first held an M1 Garand rifle. An American sergeant, supervising the processing line, had stacked a dozen M1 Garand rifles against the warehouse wall, while prisoners were being searched and documented. These were captured weapons, or perhaps spares from the guard detail, and they sat there unloaded, their dark walnut stocks gleaming under the warehouse's electric lights. Klaus, waiting in line for his interview, found his eyes drawn to them repeatedly. The rifles looked substantial, well made, but not particularly remarkable from a distance. When Klaus's turn came for processing, the American interviewer, a lieutenant who spoke serviceable German, asked the standard questions about unit designation, commanding officers, and recent movements. Klaus answered carefully, providing only name, rank, and serial number, as Geneva Convention protocols required. The American lieutenant didn't press him. Instead, he made notes on a form, stamped it, and gestured for Klaus to move to the next station. It was at this next station that everything changed. An American corporal, responsible for demonstrating weapons safety procedures to the prisoners, picked up one of the M1 Garands from the stack. He held it up so the assembled prisoners could see it clearly, then began to explain, through a translator, the basic operation of the weapon. This was standard procedure, designed to prevent accidents if prisoners encountered abandoned weapons or were assigned to labor details where they might handle American equipment. The corporal worked the rifle's operating rod handle, demonstrating how the bolt opened. He showed them the 8-round en-bloc clip, explaining how it loaded from the top of the receiver. He demonstrated the gas system, pointing out the gas cylinder and piston beneath the barrel. And then he said something that made Klaus's blood run cold. "This is the standard rifle," the translator said, "issued to every American infantryman. Every soldier in a rifle squad carries this weapon." Klaus had been half listening, exhausted and processing the strange unreality of captivity. But those words snapped him to full attention. Every American infantryman, not specialists, not elite units. Every soldier. The corporal, perhaps noticing the stirring of interest among the prisoners, elaborated. He explained that the rifle was semi-automatic, firing 1 round each time the trigger was pulled, without requiring manual operation of a bolt. He demonstrated the rate of fire by dry firing the weapon, his finger pulling the trigger in rapid succession, click, 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 faster than any bolt-action rifle could possibly cycle. Klaus raised his hand. The translator nodded at him. "How many of these rifles," Klaus asked in halting English, "does each squad have?" The translator conferred with the corporal, then turned back to Klaus. "In a standard American rifle squad? All of them. 8 riflemen, 8 Garands. Plus the squad leader has 1, and the assistant squad leader. 10 men, 10 Garands. The only soldiers who don't carry the Garand are the bar man and his assistant." The warehouse seemed to tilt slightly. Klaus had spent a week fighting against American infantry positions. He had assumed, had been taught to assume, that the intense rifle fire he experienced came from a combination of machine guns, submachine guns, and bolt-action rifles fired by numerous defenders. The possibility that each individual American rifleman could fire as rapidly as Klaus could work his bolt had never occurred to him. It couldn't have occurred to him, because such a thing violated everything he understood about infantry organization and weapons distribution. Another prisoner, a Feldwebel, sergeant, who had been captured near Bastogne, spoke up. "That cannot be correct," he said, his voice carrying the authority of rank and experience. "Such weapons are too expensive, too complex for general issue. They must be reserved for assault troops or special formations." The American corporal, understanding enough German to catch the gist of the objection, smiled slightly. It was not a cruel smile, but it carried a certain satisfaction. Through the translator, he replied, "We've made over 4 million of them. Every infantry division, every regiment, every company, every squad, they're as standard as boots." The Feldwebel fell silent. 4 million. The number was absurd, impossible. Germany's entire production of the Gewehr 43, their closest equivalent, had been 400,000 rifles, and those had been distributed selectively to units on critical fronts. The Americans had produced 10 times that number, and had distributed them universally. Klaus asked if he could hold one of the rifles. The corporal hesitated, then agreed, first removing the bolt to render the weapon completely inoperable. He handed the rifle to Klaus, who took it with the careful reverence of a soldier examining enemy equipment. The first thing Klaus noticed was the weight. The Garand was heavy, about 4.5 kilograms, noticeably heavier than his own Karabiner 98 Kurds, but the weight felt balanced, distributed evenly between the stock and the barrel. The wood was high-quality walnut, beautifully finished. The metal components showed excellent machining, with tight tolerances and smooth surfaces. This was not crude wartime production. This was precision engineering, mass-produced. Klaus worked the operating rod, feeling the smooth action of the bolt carrier. Even without the bolt installed, he could sense the mechanical sophistication of the gas system. He examined the trigger group, noting the clean, crisp feel of the trigger pull. He looked down the barrel, seeing the precision of the rifling. Every aspect of the weapon spoke to careful design and high manufacturing standards. And every American infantryman carried one. Klaus handed the rifle back to the corporal. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from cold, exhaustion, or the dawning realization of what he had just learned, he could not say. He thought about the attack on Elsenborn Ridge. He thought about the withering fire that had cut down his company. He recalculated the engagement in his mind, substituting the reality of M1 Garans for the assumption of bolt-action rifles. If the American platoon that had defended that position had consisted of 40 men, and if 30 of those men carried Garans, allowing for machine gunners, barmen, and officers, then the theoretical rate of fire from those 30 rifles alone would have been 1,200 to 1,500 aimed shots per minute. That was equivalent to a single MG-42 firing at moderate rate, except those shots were coming from 30 different positions across a 200-meter front, making it impossible to suppress them all with a single machine gun. And unlike a machine gun, which needed to pause for barrel changes and ammunition reloading, 30 individual Garans could sustain that rate of fire almost indefinitely, each soldier firing and reloading independently. Klaus had not been defeated by superior numbers or better tactics. He had been defeated by superior technology, multiplied across every single American soldier in the field. The playing field had never been level. The Wehrmacht had sent its infantry to fight with weapons designed for the First World War, while the Americans had armed their soldiers with weapons designed for the next war. Over the next 3 days, as prisoners were processed and organized for transfer to permanent POW camps, Klaus spoke with other recently captured German soldiers. Their experiences varied depending on where and when they had been captured. But a common theme emerged: shock at the abundance and quality of American equipment. A Panzer crewman from the 2nd SS Panzer Division described being captured after his Panther tank was disabled by American fighter bombers. While waiting for transport to the rear, he had watched American logistics units unloading supplies. "They threw away more food in an hour than my crew received in a week," he said. "Cigarettes, chocolate, canned fruit, things we haven't seen in months, were so abundant they were being distributed to prisoners." An artillery observer from the 326th Volksgrenadier Division had been captured near St. Vith. He described American artillery concentrations that had struck his unit's positions with devastating accuracy. "They have artillery pieces everywhere," he said. "And the ammunition. They fire as if there's no limit. We were rationing shells. They were using them for harassment fire on individual foxholes. But it was the small arms that kept coming up in conversations. Soldiers who had fought against American infantry universally reported being surprised by the volume and intensity of rifle fire. Many, like Klaus, had attributed it to numerical superiority or to concentrations of machine guns. Now, learning about the M1 Garan's universal deployment, they were recalculating their combat experiences and reaching disturbing conclusions. A lieutenant, who had commanded an infantry platoon in the Ardennes, spoke to Klaus on Christmas Day. His name was Friedrich, and he had been captured on December 21st, after his platoon was surrounded near Rockerath. Friedrich was older, perhaps 28, and had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. "I thought the Russians were well equipped," Friedrich said, accepting a cigarette from an American guard. "Their PPSH submachine guns, their T-34 tanks, good equipment, used en masse. But the Americans are different. It's not just that they have good equipment, it's that every single soldier has the best equipment. There are no shortages, no substitutions, no making do with captured weapons or obsolete stocks. A private in an American rifle squad carries a better rifle than I do as an officer." Friedrich drew on the cigarette, savoring it. American cigarettes, Klaus noted. Abundant enough to distribute to prisoners. "We were told that American industrial production was wasteful," Friedrich continued, "that they made quantity without quality. But this," he gestured vaguely toward the warehouse where they were housed, "this is both quantity and quality. They've outproduced us in every category, and they've maintained higher standards than we have." Klaus asked what Friedrich thought it meant for the war. The lieutenant was quiet for a long moment. "It means the war is over," he finally said. "We just haven't stopped dying yet." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the days following his capture, as Klaus was transferred from the processing camp to a larger POW facility in France, he had time to think through the implications of what he had learned. The mathematics were simple, brutal, and inescapable. A standard American rifle squad in 1944 consisted of 12 men, organized into 3 fire teams of 4 men each. Each fire team included a bar gunner, an assistant bar gunner, and 2 riflemen, all armed with M1 Garands, except the bar gunner who carried the Browning automatic rifle. The squad leader and assistant squad leader also carried Garands. This meant that in a 12-man squad, 10 soldiers carried M1 Garands and 1 carried a bar. A standard German infantry squad consisted of 10 men, the squad leader with an MP-40 submachine gun, a 2-man MG-42 team, and 7 riflemen with Karabiner 98 Kurz bolt-action rifles. In terms of pure firepower, the single MG-42 could produce more rounds per minute than all the American weapons combined. But firepower had to be considered in context. The MG-42 required a 2-man team to operate effectively. It required a stable position for accurate fire. It consumed ammunition at prodigious rates. A sustained burst could empty a 50-round belt in less than 3 seconds. It required frequent barrel changes to prevent overheating, and most critically, it was a single point of failure. If the MG-42 was disabled, the German squad's firepower dropped by roughly 70%. The American squad, by contrast, distributed its firepower across 11 individual weapons. If one Garand-equipped soldier was disabled, the squad lost less than 10% of its rifle firepower. The BR provided a base of automatic fire, similar in role to the German MG-42, but lighter and more mobile. And the 10 Garands provided a sustained volume of semi-automatic fire that could engage multiple targets simultaneously across a wide front. Klaus worked through a specific scenario in his mind. Imagine a meeting engagement, a situation where a German squad and an American squad encountered each other at a range of 100 meters, with both sides taking cover and engaging. The German squad's optimal tactic would be to immediately set up the MG-42 in a position with good fields of fire, while the riflemen maneuvered or provided covering fire with their bolt-action rifles. The American squad could immediately bring all 11 weapons to bear, with each soldier firing independently from whatever cover was available. In the first 10 seconds of such an engagement, the German MG-42 might fire 100 rounds in controlled bursts, while the 7 German riflemen might fire a total of 20 to 30 aimed shots with their bolt-action rifles. Total rounds fired, perhaps 130. In those same 10 seconds, the American bar might fire 40 rounds in controlled bursts, while the 10 Garand-equipped soldiers might fire 80 to 100 aimed shots. Total rounds fired, approximately 120 to 140. The numbers were roughly comparable, but here was the crucial difference. The German firepower was concentrated in a single weapon system that required a static position and was vulnerable to suppression or destruction. The American firepower was distributed across 11 positions, making it nearly impossible to suppress all of them simultaneously. Moreover, as the engagement continued beyond those first 10 seconds, the dynamics shifted dramatically. The MG-42 would need to pause for barrel changes if sustained fire continued. The German riflemen, working their bolts between shots, would struggle to maintain rate of fire under pressure. The American soldiers, simply pulling their triggers, could sustain their initial rate of fire for as long as their 8-round clips held out, and reloading an M1 Garand took approximately 2 seconds, compared to perhaps 4 to 6 seconds to work a bolt, aim, and fire with a Karabiner 98 Kurz. This was not hypothetical mathematics. This was the tactical reality that Klaus had experienced on Elsenborn Ridge without understanding it. The American defensive position had been able to deliver such devastating fire not because they had more soldiers or more machine guns, but because every single soldier had the capacity to fire rapidly and accurately without pause. As Klaus settled into the routine of POW camp life, he had opportunities to speak with other prisoners who had served in different branches of the Wehrmacht. These conversations revealed that the M1 Garand was merely one example of a systematic American advantage that extended across every aspect of military organization. A former logistics officer explained the American supply system. "They have trucks for everything," he said. "Every company has organic motor transport. Every battalion has dedicated supply vehicles. When we moved, we relied on horse-drawn wagons and requisitioned civilian vehicles. When they move, they bring everything with them: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. And their repair capacity is extraordinary. Broken vehicles are evacuated and repaired. Our units cannibalized damaged equipment because we had no replacement parts." A former artillery officer described American fire support procedures. "Their forward observers have radio communication with battalion fire direction centers," he explained. "They can call in artillery fire on any target within minutes. Our forward observers often had to send runners back to battery positions because we didn't have enough radios. By the time fire missions were processed, the targets had moved." A former Panzer officer discussed American armor. "Their Shermans are inferior to our Panthers and Tigers in direct combat," he admitted. "But they have 10 Shermans for every one of our heavy tanks. And their air support, once the weather cleared over the Ardennes, their fighter bombers were everywhere. We couldn't move in daylight. We couldn't concentrate our armor for counterattacks. They owned the sky." The pattern was consistent across every domain. The Americans had accepted that individual pieces of equipment might not be the absolute best in their class, but they had produced those pieces of equipment in such quantities and had integrated them so thoroughly into their organizational structure that they achieved overwhelming superiority through systematic advantage rather than through individual technological excellence. The M1 Garand exemplified this philosophy perfectly. Was it the best possible infantry rifle? Perhaps not. One could imagine improvements in caliber, capacity, or weight. But it was reliable, accurate, powerful, and manufacturable at scale. And by equipping every single infantryman with this weapon, the United States had created rifle squads whose collective firepower exceeded anything the Wehrmacht could field without dedicating machine gun teams to every small unit. Klaus thought about the training he had received, the doctrine he had been taught, the confidence he had carried into battle. All of it had been based on assumptions that were simply false. German tactical doctrine was sophisticated, but it had been developed for an army that could not afford to equip every soldier with advanced weapons. American tactical doctrine might be simpler, but it was supported by an industrial base that could afford to give every private a semi-automatic rifle, every squad a vehicle, every battalion abundant artillery support. This was not a fair fight between equivalent forces where superior training and tactics might carry the day. This was a systematic mismatch where one side had fundamentally more resources applied to every level of military organization. The winter of 1945 passed slowly for Klaus Hartmann. The POW camp in France where he was held, a sprawling complex of barracks surrounded by wire fencing, housed several thousand German prisoners. The American guards were generally professional, the food was adequate if monotonous, and the conditions, while Spartan, were far better than the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes. But the psychological adjustment to captivity proved harder than the physical adjustment. Klaus was not suffering from harsh treatment or deprivation. He was suffering from the collapse of a worldview. Throughout January and February of 1945, new prisoners arrived regularly, captured during the continuing Allied advance into Germany. Each wave brought news of the war's progress, and each report confirmed what Klaus had begun to understand. Germany was not merely losing battles, it was being systematically overwhelmed by an enemy whose material advantages made the outcome inevitable. A Panzer crewman captured near the Rhine described American artillery preparations before river crossings. "They fired for hours," he said. "Thousands of shells. The earth itself seemed to liquefy. Our bunkers collapsed. Our communication trenches filled with debris. And when the barrage lifted, the infantry came across with such abundance of equipment, flame tanks, bridge layers, amphibious vehicles, that our defensive positions were simply bypassed or buried." An infantry officer captured during the Colmar pocket fighting spoke of American air superiority. "We saw perhaps 3 Luftwaffe aircraft in 2 weeks of combat," he said. Meanwhile, American fighters flew overhead constantly. Their observation planes directed artillery fire. Their fighter bombers attacked any concentration of troops or vehicles. We learned to move only at night, in small groups dispersed, and still they found us. But it was the small details that struck Klaus most forcefully. A prisoner who had been captured in March described American soldiers eating fresh oranges, while on the front lines. Another described seeing American supply trucks delivering hot coffee in insulated containers to forward positions. A third mentioned that American soldiers received new socks and underwear regularly, preventing the foot rot and skin infections that plagued German troops. These were not decisive military advantages. Fresh oranges did not win battles, but they revealed something profound about relative industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. An army that could deliver fresh fruit to front-line soldiers was an army whose logistics system worked at a level of sophistication that the Wehrmacht could not match. An army whose privates wore clean socks was an army that valued the health and morale of its individual soldiers enough to dedicate shipping space and organizational effort to mundane necessities. Klaus remembered the state of his own equipment when he was captured. His boots had holes in the soles, stuffed with newspaper for insulation. His uniform was threadbare. He had not received new socks in 6 weeks. His rifle was well maintained. Soldiers took care of their weapons even when everything else fell apart. But the 40 rounds of ammunition he carried represented his entire allocation, with no prospect of resupply. He had been hungry, cold, and exhausted, not because of tactical circumstances, but because the German supply system was collapsing under the weight of strategic overextension and industrial inadequacy. The Americans he had encountered, by contrast, had been well fed, warmly clothed, and abundantly equipped. This was not because American soldiers were softer or more pampered. It was because the American military-industrial complex could afford to provide these things to millions of soldiers simultaneously while still maintaining massive production of weapons, vehicles, and ammunition. In April of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, Klaus was assigned to a work detail repairing damaged railroad infrastructure near the POW camp. The work was supervised by American engineers, and the prisoners worked alongside African-American service troops from the Quartermaster Corps. It was during this work that Klaus had his first extended conversations with American soldiers. His English was improving through necessity, and several of the American soldiers spoke some German, having been in Europe since the Normandy invasion. One conversation in particular stayed with Klaus for the rest of his life. He was working with a corporal from Ohio, a man named Robert, who had served as a rifleman with the 29th Infantry Division and had been wounded during the Normandy breakout. Robert now served in a support role while recovering from his injuries. During a break, sitting on railroad ties in the spring sunshine, Klaus asked Robert about the M1 Garand. Robert pulled his rifle. He still carried it even in his support assignment, and began describing his experience with the weapon. "I trained with it for 6 months before we shipped overseas," Robert said. "We fired thousands of rounds. They wanted us so comfortable with it that we could field strip it blindfolded, clear malfunctions by feel, load, and fire under any conditions. By the time we hit Omaha Beach, that rifle was like an extension of my arm." He demonstrated the loading procedure, snapping an empty clip into the receiver with practiced efficiency. "The 8-round capacity was a limitation sometimes," he admitted. "You learned to count your shots. But the reliability was incredible. I was in combat for 43 days before I was wounded, and my rifle never jammed. Not once. Through mud, sand, rain, it just worked." Klaus asked how many rifles Robert thought the United States had produced. Robert shrugged. "Millions, I guess. Every rifleman in every division carries one. Every training base has them. Hell, we probably have warehouses full of spares. That's what America does. We build things in enormous quantities." This was stated without boast, just simple fact. Robert seemed to understand that this abundance was not a personal achievement, but a national characteristic. He offered Klaus a cigarette, American of course, and they smoked in companionable silence for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Robert said eventually. "Why did Germany think it could win? I mean, you had to know about American production capacity. We were building ships faster than your U-boats could sink them. We were making aircraft by the thousands. Didn't your leaders understand what they were up against?" Klaus had no good answer. He tried to explain about propaganda, about the confidence that superior training and tactics would overcome material disadvantages, about the belief that American soldiers were poorly motivated and would collapse under determined assault. But even as he spoke, the words sounded hollow. Germany had gambled that it could achieve decisive victories before American industrial might could be fully mobilized, and that gamble had failed catastrophically. Robert listened, then shook his head. "My grandfather fought in the First War," he said. "He told me Germany was the most dangerous enemy America ever faced because German soldiers were disciplined and their equipment was excellent. But he also said that once America committed to a war, we would win it through sheer production. Guess he was right twice." The conversation haunted Klaus. The truth that Robert articulated so casually, that the outcome had been essentially predetermined once the United States fully committed its industrial capacity to the war, was something Klaus had been circling around for months but had not wanted to fully acknowledge. It meant that his service, his suffering, the deaths of his comrades, all of it, had been in pursuit of an objective that was never truly achievable. Germany had not lost because its soldiers fought poorly or its tactics were flawed. Germany had lost because it had challenged enemies whose combined industrial capacity so vastly exceeded its own that no amount of tactical skill or individual bravery could bridge the gap. On May 8, 1945, word spread through the POW camp that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Klaus received the news with a mixture of relief and emptiness. Relief that the killing had stopped, that his family in Germany, if they had survived, would no longer be at risk from aerial bombardment or ground combat. Emptiness because the certainties that had structured his entire young life had proven to be lies. He had been taught that Germany was strong, that its enemies were weak, that the Reich would triumph through superior will and capability. Every single part of that narrative had been false. Germany was not strong. It had exhausted itself fighting enemies whose resources it could not match. Its enemies were not weak. They had crushed the Wehrmacht through systematic application of industrial power. And the Reich had not triumphed. It had led Germany to utter destruction. The M1 Garand, that beautifully engineered rifle that Klaus had held in a Belgian warehouse on Christmas Eve, had become for him a symbol of this larger truth. It represented not just American technological capability, but American industrial philosophy, the recognition that wars were won not by producing the absolute best individual weapons, but by producing very good weapons in quantities sufficient to equip every soldier, integrated into organizational structures that could employ those weapons effectively. In the weeks following the surrender, Klaus learned more details about the war's final stages. The Soviet advance from the east had been even more devastating than the American and British advance from the west, with Russian forces capturing Berlin and forcing Hitler's suicide. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had forced Japan's surrender in August. The industrial civilization that had enabled these outcomes, the capacity to build nuclear weapons, to deploy millions of soldiers across multiple continents, to sustain combat operations for years while simultaneously maintaining domestic economies, was something Germany had challenged and been destroyed by. Klaus remained in American custody until February of 1946. The process of repatriating millions of prisoners took time, complicated by the division of Germany into occupation zones and the chaos of Europe's post-war reorganization. During these months, Klaus worked on various labor details, learned better English, and tried to process what the war had meant. Other prisoners responded to defeat differently. Some retreated into bitter resentment, blaming Germany's collapse on betrayal or conspiracy rather than systematic military defeat. Others embraced a kind of nihilism, concluding that nothing they had believed mattered, and that survival was the only rational goal. Still others, particularly older soldiers who had served in the First World War, seemed almost relieved that the fighting was over, willing to accept occupation and reconstruction as preferable to continued destruction. Klaus fell into none of these categories clearly. He felt anger at having been lied to, at having believed propaganda that sent him and millions of others to fight an unwinnable war. But he also felt something more complex, a kind of awed respect for the systematic capability that had defeated Germany. The Americans and British had not merely won through brute force. They had won through intelligent application of industrial capacity, through organizational efficiency, through the ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances and maintain those operations for years. Klaus was finally repatriated to Germany in February of 1946. The train that carried him and several hundred other former POWs crossed into the American occupation zone and deposited them at a processing center near Frankfurt. From there, Klaus made his way back to his hometown in Bavaria. The Germany he returned to bore little resemblance to the nation he had left. Cities were rubble fields, infrastructure was destroyed, millions of people were displaced, either refugees from the East fleeing Soviet occupation, or former soldiers trying to return home, or civilians evacuated during the final bombing campaigns. Food was scarce, fuel was scarce, housing was scarce. The economy had collapsed. The Nazi Party was banned, and its leaders either dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. Klaus found his family's home still standing but damaged by bombing. His father, too old for military service, had survived. His mother had died during an air raid in 1944. His younger sister had survived and was living with relatives. The family farm had been requisitioned for food production and was now under Allied occupation authority control. In the years that followed, Klaus worked various jobs as Germany began its slow reconstruction. He rarely spoke about his military service, and when he did, he focused on generalities rather than specifics. The shame of having fought for a criminal regime, the trauma of combat, the disillusionment of discovering how thoroughly he had been deceived, all of this was easier to suppress than to examine. But the M1 Garand stayed with him. Decades later, in the 1970s and 80s, when historians and researchers began interviewing German veterans about their wartime experiences, Klaus would tell the story of holding that rifle in a Belgian warehouse and understanding in that moment that Germany had never had a chance. The weapon became for him a metonym for American power, not just military power, but industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and the systematic advantages that made victory inevitable once the United States fully committed to war. In a 1987 interview conducted as part of an oral history project documenting the Battle of the Bulge, Klaus was asked what he thought had been the decisive factor in Germany's defeat. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I could say many things," he said. "I could talk about strategic mistakes, about fighting on too many fronts, about the crimes of the regime driving the Allies to demand unconditional surrender. All of that is true, but for me, the moment I understood we had lost was when an American corporal showed me a rifle and told me that every American soldier carried one. Not elite troops, not specialists, every soldier. That's when I understood that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting an industrial system that could outproduce us in every category while maintaining higher quality. You cannot defeat that with tactics or bravery. You can only survive it or be destroyed by it." The interviewer asked if Klaus felt bitter about his experience. Klaus shook his head. "Bitter? No. I was angry for many years, but not bitter. I was 19 years old, and I believed what I was taught. The people who should feel shame are those who created the lies, who started the war, who sent millions to die for their fantasies of conquest. I was a fool, but I was a young fool. I learned. Germany learned. And perhaps that learning was worth the cost, if it prevents us from making the same mistakes again." The story of Klaus Hartmann and his encounter with the M1 Garand is not unique. Thousands of German prisoners of war had similar experiences, discovering that their understanding of the war had been shaped by propaganda and incomplete information. The systematic advantages that the Allied powers, particularly the United States, brought to bear in World War II extended far beyond infantry rifles. But those rifles serve as a powerful symbol of the larger reality. The M1 Garand remained in American service until the 1960s, when it was replaced by the M414 rifle. General George Patton famously called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. And while that assessment was hyperbolic, the rifle's combination of reliability, accuracy, and firepower made it genuinely revolutionary for its time. More importantly, the decision to adopt it as the standard infantry weapon, to equip millions of soldiers with semi-automatic rifles, rather than reserving such weapons for elite units, represented a fundamental philosophical difference in how America approached military procurement. Germany's approach to military equipment emphasized technical excellence and specialization. The Wehrmacht fielded some of the finest individual weapons systems of the war: the MG-42 machine gun, the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther tank, the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. But these weapons were produced in limited quantities, and German forces often had to make do with inadequate numbers of excellent equipment supplemented by older or captured weapons. America's approach emphasized reliable, mass-produced equipment that could be manufactured and distributed at scale. The M1 Garand was not the most sophisticated rifle that could have been designed in 1936, but it was sophisticated enough, and more importantly, it could be manufactured by the millions and issued universally. This philosophy extended across the American military. The M4 Sherman tank was not the best tank in the war, but 5 Shermans could be built for the cost of 1 German Panther, and mechanical reliability meant that American armor could maintain operational readiness rates that German forces could not match. The lessons of this approach influenced military procurement for the rest of the 20th century. The recognition that systematic advantages, abundant equipment, reliable supply lines, organizational depth, could overcome individual tactical or technological superiority became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The Soviet Union drew similar conclusions from its wartime experience, emphasizing mass production and numerical superiority over technical sophistication. For Germany, the lessons were more painful. The nation that had prided itself on engineering excellence and military prowess had been defeated by enemies whose industrial capacity and organizational systems proved more effective than German technical sophistication. The post-war Bundeswehr, when it was established in the 1950s, adopted an approach to military organization that emphasized integration with NATO allies and realistic assessment of capabilities rather than nationalist myths of superiority. Klaus Hartmann died in 1994, having lived to see the reunification of Germany and the end of the Cold War. In his later years, he occasionally spoke to school groups about his wartime experiences, always emphasizing the dangers of propaganda and the importance of questioning nationalist narratives. He kept, in a drawer in his study, a photograph of an M1 Garand rifle that he had found in a military history magazine. It served as a reminder of the moment his worldview shattered and the long process of rebuilding it on more honest foundations. The story of German prisoners discovering the M1 Garand is ultimately a story about the collision between ideology and material reality. Klaus and millions of other German soldiers had been taught that their cause was just, their equipment superior, their enemies weak. They had been sent to fight a war based on these false premises, and when they encountered the reality that their enemies were better equipped, better supplied, and supported by industrial systems that Germany could not hope to match, they faced a choice between clinging to comforting lies or accepting painful truths. Many chose truth eventually, but the cost of learning those truths was measured in millions of lives lost, cities destroyed, and a civilization brought to the brink of annihilation. The M1 Garand, sitting in that Belgian warehouse on Christmas Eve of 1944, represented not just American industrial capacity, but the price of German delusion. Every semi-automatic rifle in American hands was a refutation of Nazi propaganda. Every well-fed American soldier was evidence that German claims of cultural superiority were hollow. Every abundant supply dump demonstrated that Germany's enemies possessed exactly what German leadership had claimed they lacked: the industrial strength and organizational capability to sustain modern warfare. Klaus Hartmann's moment of recognition, holding that rifle and understanding what it meant, was replicated thousands of times across the prisoner of war camps of Europe. It was a collective disillusionment, a generation of German soldiers discovering that they had been deceived and that their sacrifice had been in service of a lie. Out of that disillusionment came, eventually, a more honest reckoning with Germany's past and a commitment to building a future based on truth rather than nationalist mythology. The M1 Garand was just a rifle, but in the hands of millions of American soldiers, supported by the industrial might of the United States, it became a symbol of something larger, the triumph of systematic capability over individual excellence, the victory of industrial democracy over military autocracy, and the ultimate futility of fighting against enemies whose resources and organization made their victory, in the end, mathematically inevitable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.